Let's take a look at this problem that deals with the computation and application of an overhead rate, and then we'll look at the disposition of the over-applied overhead as well. Alright, now reading to the left of my mouse here, under E14 it says, Compumatics specializes in the analysis and reporting of complex inventory costing projects. Materials costs are minimal, consisting entirely of operating supplies. And then in parentheses it discusses DVDs, inventory sheets, and other recording tools. Labor is the highest single expense, totaling $693,000 for 75,000 hours of work in 2008. Overhead costs for 2008 were $916,000 and were applied to specific jobs on the basis of labor hours worked. In 2009, the company anticipates a 25% increase in overhead costs. Labor cost will increase by $130,000, and the number of hours worked is expected to increase by 20%. Okay, first we're asked to determine the total amount of overhead anticipated in 2009. Okay, let's move over here where we can work on that. Okay, for number one, and I've worked this ahead of time so that it'll save some time in the demo. For number one, we need to consider the anticipated overhead rates. And what we know is we had $916,000 to start, and they're expecting a 25% increase. So that's pretty straightforward. Here all we need to do, and I'll just bring all of these to light, is take the $916,000 times the 125%, and we've come up with $1,145,000. That's the amount of overhead we're expecting to be incurred. Now, if we want to determine the overhead rate, we need to first determine the increase in labor hours. All right. Now, I believe we started with, was it at 75,000 hours? We had 75,000 hours in 2008, and we're expecting an increase of 130 hours and an increase by 20%. So if we jot in the information here, we take the 75,000 hours times, this should be times 120%, and it didn't show up here. Let me drop that in. And that needs to be as a percentage. And that will equal $90,000. So we just simply take the 75,000 times the 120,000. Oh, hit my F2 key. And we come up with 90,000 hours. And I think I want to move that to the left side of the screen. Okay, so with that, we can determine the predetermined overhead rate by dropping in the 1145, right? And then this needs to be the division signal. I'm just going to use a slash. Okay, divided by, it should say 90,000 hours, but it doesn't have it. Let me jot it in right here and turn that into black. 90,000 hours, and what that will equal, bring that to light, it will equal $13 per labor hour. And I think what I want to do is slide this one over here. It looks like it's an merged cell. Let me see if it'll work. Yeah, 90,000. And just put an equals in there so you can see that. Okay, so we come up with a more exact number, $12.72 per labor hour. Okay, then if we want to apply overhead, we now know the $12.72 is the overhead rate. And let's take a look at number 3 again, or the third thing we need to do. Determine the total amount of overhead anticipated. We did that. Number 2 said compute the overhead rate. We did that as well. Okay, now there's also a part 3 that I didn't copy in here, and I want to go over that as well. Part 3 says during April of 2009, 11,980 labor hours were worked. Calculate the overhead amount assigned to April production. Okay, so if we jot in the 11,980, then all we do is multiply it times the $12.72, which for some reason doesn't want to show up. So I'll just type it in. And if we jotted that in, that would equal $572. So let me slide this over. It doesn't want to move because it's a merged cell. Let me just do it this way. Equal that times that. And turn this just into an equal sign. Okay? And that takes care of number 3, which would, let me format this correctly, which would be if we had 11,980 hours worked in the subsequent month, how much overhead would be applied? And that takes care of exercise 14. Okay, now let's take a look at exercise 15, which says, at the end of 2009, Compumatics had compiled a total of 89,920 labor hours worked, and the actual overhead incurred was $1,143,400. Using the overhead rate that we computed previously, determine the total amount of overhead applied to operations during 2009. So, since we've already computed the 1272, we would just take that 89,920 hours and multiply it times the 1272 to come up with how much overhead was applied. Okay? And again, it still doesn't want to give me my nice formats, so I'll drop those in. And the answer is $1,143,782, and that's rounded. Okay? Number 2 says compute the amount of over-applied overhead for the year. Okay, well, to compute the overhead applied, we first have to say how much was applied. Oh, and what we're looking for is the amount of the over-applied overhead. I've got to say that correctly. And I think I want to merge all of this here. And then we'll be able to see this with the right amounts. Okay, well, we know from above the dollar amount was right there, $1,143,782. And then we need to back off. Let me bring this to light here. Merge this. Less the overhead that was occurred, and the overhead occurred came from the problem where they said it was 1143,400. So if we drop in 1143,400, all right, let me bring that to light. Then what we can compute is the overhead. Oh, let me bring this to light too. Turn this into black and format that. It should be merged, though not centered. And this would be what we would call the over-applied overhead. And the reason why it's over-applied is because the amount applied was over the amount incurred. Okay, so we can underline this and calculate $382 as the over-applied overhead. Okay, now the last part says, will the cost of goods sold account be increased or decreased to correct the over-application of overhead? All right, and this one I'm just going to speak the answer, which is, or say the answer if you will, rather than type it out. But when you look at the amount of overhead applied was 1143782, and the overhead incurred was 1143400, and we're in an over-applied position, it means that since the overhead applied amount is relatively small, we won't bother allocating that between inventory and other costs. Instead, we would take it all to cost of goods sold. And since we're in a over-applied situation, we would wind up decreasing cost of goods sold to bring the cost of goods sold in an amount to reflect what was actually incurred. Right? 1143400 was less than the overhead applied, so we would adjust cost of goods sold downward. And it's immaterial, so we'll just take it to cost of goods sold rather than to have to allocate that difference between what was produced during the year or month, whatever the period was that we're concerned with, and what would have to be applied to work in process perhaps as well as to finished goods. And that takes care of this problem. Thanks, everyone.